Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Xibalba dev stream. Today, I will be walking you guys through the latest developments on the primer page, or the main page, I guess you could say, as well as the Ansifii tech tree map, because we got some progress to report there. I guess I'll quickly also check in on Antikythera, and we'll try to make this a somewhat consistent thing, because obviously 2 days, that can be enough for some new feature to show up, so if I have something of note to take a look at, I shall. Looks like we have some stuff from Veek. These two commits were today, so I'll take a look at those. I already did take a look at these. I don't think we're that much farther in terms of brand new feature in sort of implementations or whatever, but that doesn't mean that we don't have some exciting news all the same. What's up, Mage? Happy Saturday. Hope you're doing well. I think that's Mage anyway. I always guess. And if it's the three Korean characters, then I'm like, oh yeah, it's probably him. But he'll correct me if I'm wrong. I gotta say, it feels good to be making progress fairly steadily these days. Let's take a quick gander around what we have here. I think I have... I am seeing some new debug information about tick time and frame time, which is kind of interesting. Now, if I select this guy and start moving him around, I'm not actually noticing anything massively different about Fog of War yet. And he said that he made some progress on Patrol, which is the A key. I'm not sure... I actually would have thought that Patrol was already implemented, but maybe I'm misremembering. Either way, we appear to have Patrol, which is cool. We still have the busted Drakadin animation, which I guess I should actually fix at some point. In fact, it looks like the Ecclesiastes is a bit busted as well. That should be pretty easy stuff to do. Now, to my knowledge, he also made some changes to the collision detection. I don't know what exactly that could be. It looks like units are getting sort of hitched a little bit more frequently, but then they're also sometimes stopping in places where I don't think they did previously, so that's kind of interesting. Well, I don't know. Just the fact that we can move around stuff is pretty cool, so there's that, at least. All right, I think I will leave it at there. I'll just make a mental note and a literal note as well to update the Drakadin plus Ecclesiast walk cycle because they're busted. What's up, Veek? I was actually just taking a look to see if there had been any new developments. I took a look at the Git log, and I didn't notice anything shockingly different. So I just poked around a little bit in there. Just to see what's going on, see what's up. We got updates, updates to the documentation, updates to the planning, and updates to the engine. That's how things roll around here. Now, I will say, as a point to get this out of the way early on in the VOD, as well as in the stream itself, we are looking for modelers who are interested in assisting with this project. So, as well as, I guess, concept artists in general. So if you fancy yourself an artiste, you want to help out with creating the best RTS ever made, then, yeah, well, you know where to reach me. Because while we have some people who are handling art right now, the biggest issue is that there's so much of it. So we need to somehow make sure that everything's adhering to the same art style. In that sense, I can be a sort of art director, even though I'm not massively artistic myself. But that's definitely going to be a bit of a tough part to grapple with, because we've got... By the end of the game, we'll have 2,000 units or so for Regencies, specifically. But for upstarts, there's going to be some upstarts that aren't related to Regencies at all that are going to be their own thing. So they're going to have their own set of sort of characteristics that we have to draft up. There's obviously going to be all of the structures, all of the campaign-specific stuff that might show up, all the tile sets, all the doodads. There's a lot. So I welcome the assistance if you are either A, already competent, or B, willing to become competent through iteration and discipline and practice. And you have some interest in this project. So there you go. I said my piece. I shelled for some artists. Obviously, we don't have any budget, so it's not like we can pay until the game comes out, but we can negotiate that when the game actually does ship. So obviously got to be okay with that. Got to say that up front, too. All right, where are we going from here? The Ansifii have received some updates as far as their tech tree mapping is concerned. But before I show that off, I wanted to point out that we have a mechanics section. The mechanics section is pretty epic because it actually will go through the things that we have in the games of Xibalba that are shared between all of the games. So obviously one case is resources, right? Resources are an obvious mechanic that even when you're playing Dreamhold as opposed to Cosmonarchy, you're running around as a single hero, doing your dance and performing for people and getting a lot of gear and being epic, and then probably dying to some epic boss that yells at you. Even when you're doing that, you're still fighting alongside an AI that's running an RTS gameplay loop, basically. So they're running a base, they're creating an army, all that stuff. So they're also harvesting resources. They're also doing the RTS side of things. So it's important to note that. We got tech tiers, a couple of paragraphs on those, and something that just mentions what they do, what they unlock, and trying to encapsulate what tech tiers really mean for the gameplay flow. One thing that I could probably add here is that tech tiers are obviously, as much as it is possible to go up in tiers, it's actually, even though this is so obvious to us, it's important that we specify that it's possible to go back down in tiers, that you have to protect your tech structures. I don't think that's something that I explicitly stated in these 3 paragraphs, plus the little primer at the end. So I will go back through that at some point and add that in. But besides that, I think it's fairly comprehensive as to what tech tiers do. Maybe I'll find some other things that we need to do. Beyond that, we have some explanations as to what we don't have and why. So this is the have-nots section. Obviously, chief among these is supply. Following that, upgrades. These are like the most notable things. There is a section on smart casting that talks about automated decision-making and stuff. There are a few other things that we don't have. I actually forget what they were because I don't recall if I noted them. Obviously, I have plans for armor class and penetration that I wanted to denote. And I think maybe I even specified in the Xibalba chat. Selection was going to be noted. And it doesn't look like I was going to explain. Oh, yeah, it doesn't look like I wrote down anything else. I don't remember. Maybe there wasn't anything else that I wanted to denote in have-nots yet. I'm sure there's going to be some things, though. I guess we could mention squads or something. That's a little bit lower on the totem pole, but we'll say note selection in mechanics, note squads in have-nots. As far as Roshi's involvement, yeah, if he's interested in checking it out, in contributing, would be interesting. Okay, we should add our little marker that says we haven't done this yet. So noting the armor class and penetration system is going to be the first proper task for today. But like I said, I did promise that I would show off the Ansifii tech tiers, so I will do that now. Right now we have, 11 concepts for units and 4 concepts for structures. We're very basic currently, but we do have some ideas. We got some things to work with. So obviously we got the quarry. Now the quarry is funnily named because the quarry was an add-on to a command center in Cosmonarchy Brood War. I've taken the name quarry because it's almost like like it says in the origin field at the bottom right, the bedrock of industry, right? It's like where everything starts from. So instead of conceptualizing the initial town center as this notable HQ, this headquarters that's like massively important. I mean, it's important, but it's mostly, catered around mining operations. The Ansifii actually were originally meant to be specifically a race of hominids that were used to harvest resources from like dangerous mining operations, and they were like entered into cooperation with humans because humans weren't able to lift the equipment necessary. They weren't physically as strong as the Ansifii. Back then, my code name for them was prospectors because that's like a mining term. Obviously, that's an action verb, so we wouldn't have gone with that, but that's like the code name that I had for them. So it's kind of interesting to get a little bit of an echo of their origins insofar as what the quarry is and the mason. Maybe we'll have mason be a little bit more of a worker, like that's oriented towards construction as opposed to harvesting, but I think it's fine to keep this for now. It's a skilled craftsman, and it does have the repair idea, so this stuff was here before. We also had the Maverick and the Squire, and they have not actually received any changes to my knowledge, but they do come from the Gallery, which is the infantry production facility, a proper firing range, which also trains a whole host of other units, including the Rival. Now, the Rival, all these names, by the way, are indeed placeholder to some extent. Work in progress, the working title. These may change over time. However, we do have the Rival. It's got like a pair of fists, basically power fists. It's like a power suit, and it's going to be mostly used to reduce the movement speed of enemies. It doesn't deal massively fatal damage, but it will be a pretty heavy hitter, and I think it'll also move pretty fast compared to the Maverick or something. It'll be able to gap close based on just sheer movement speed, and then be able to stick to you while also like preventing you from being able to properly flank or properly run away, because you're hamstringing your victims and reducing their movement speed. Now, this is just a flat 25% as soon as you've been tagged. It's not something that stacks. Not sure if that will change, but we'll have to play around with a lot of this stuff and see how it feels. I'm very much a guy who like wants to plug stuff in and see how it feels, as opposed to worrying about like getting the concept nailed down 100%. There are some concepts that are just super obvious that they'll work out, and we just go from there. But all of the numbers, all of the stats, all of the sort of nature of whether or not something stacks or whether or not it's permanent or whether it has a time limit or something. I guess I didn't even mention that the movement speed thing actually does expire, because I forgot to do so. Whatever the time limit would be, we could say it's like expires after 2 seconds of not being refreshed or something. Spellcasting will be a pain if you have like 100 spellcasters. Hopefully they won't become underwhelming, since we wouldn't want to buff them just because they are hard to use. Well, I don't think you would have 100 spellcasters insofar as they would be 100 debuffed or distinct spellcasters. I don't think you would ever really be in a situation like that. But I do echo the sentiment that it is a bit of an issue with scale. Like, if you ever are in control of a large number of distinct spellcasters, that is something that is going to be a bit of a challenge. Now, in this case, spellcaster really just refers to anything with an active ability, and I think that's fine to consider as far as like, do we want that many units with active abilities that specifically that need to be like select the unit and then issue an order? Like, it's not something that you can engage with via right click or something, right? So when you have that, yeah, that is going to be a bit tough. I did have an old concept, and I guess it might be worth revisiting to decide if we want it, where you would have a power, like an ability panel, as a separate dedicated part of the UI, where it would show the abilities of selected units, so you could immediately issue them. The trouble is that obviously that is like by definition automating, but because of maybe taking it from a different angle, but using something similar would actually be useful. And maybe it would be something like when you're group selecting a bunch of units. So I'll use Brood War as the way to just describe this. So Brood War has a bunch of mechanics associated with it already, where if you can see that when you mouse over, it actually says click, select unit, shift click, deselect unit, control click, select unit type. So I control click on the Zethra core, and I select all 3 Zethra cores that I had selected previously while deselecting this. So if I hold control 1 to put this group into a control group, and then I select and then control click Zethra core, that's like a very quick way for me to be like, okay, I'm going to right click these units. Oh, I want my Zethra cores to go below. Okay, I'll control click them from the selection and do it. It feels very intuitive. I don't actually use this very often, but if you were to get into the habit of doing it, it would feel very intuitive. Now, what if instead of having a 12 unit selection limit, we would instead, so I'll take this screenshot actually, and we'll do a quick mock-up in Photoshop using it, because I actually think that the visual aspect of this is pretty important. Let me just move this to my other monitor. As that. Okay. So if I take this and then I save it as PNG, we'll be able to edit it. I think this UI thing that I'm about to show you guys is pretty important. So that's why I'm willing to take some time and do it in this sense. We're gonna just fill this with black. And then what we'll do is we will take these, layer via cut, and then so I guess we could actually just move this whole thing over here. So instead of showing you what you normally see, instead of layer via cut, I should probably layer via copy, so I can oscillate between the two. So, all right, to be clear, this is what you would normally see this when you have these selected. Now instead, imagine you see this along with, wait for it. Let me find a reasonable font, I guess. That one doesn't even have numbers, so that's not reasonable. I'm sure you guys can see where I'm going with this, though. Apparently, it's a font that does not scale very well, I guess. All right. So we'll say, I guess this color should be different. We'll use white for now. We have 3 threes, obviously, so that's pretty important. So if you instead had something like this, you would have, instantly you would know how many you have. And I think, even though you're losing information about like specific ones that are becoming weak, this is actually way better for overall grand scale selecting, 100,000 units at a time or whatever. Even with 1,000 units, like with the selection and scale we're going for, you're still going to need a scroll bar to this anyway, the way StarCraft 2 did it, unfortunately, I feel like. But I like the idea of it just telling you how many you have. Like, I feel like if you have something like this, and then you control-click the Zethra core, you know exactly how many Zethra cores you're going to select. I think that would be better. And then you can take the idea that I had previously where there'd be a dedicated slot of the UI that shows you like what abilities you have access to. Instead of doing that, which would automate the act of selecting those units and then issuing the order, you just have this where it says you've got, 6 High Templar. Obviously, they're not going to be in the game, but as an example, I got to cast Psystorm. How many High Templar do I have? I have 6. Control-click, cast Psystorm. Like that element, and then like reselect my whole control group with like the 1 key or whatever that control group is on. I think that's way better actually than, yeah, exactly. So what Vik had said in the chat, he preempted me. An icon one icon per unit type with a counter. I think that's way better for this sort of thing. So we'll say 3 mockup. Just so that I can save that for later. I think that's going to be more useful for this. So it's the difference between, I guess I'll call this 2 mockup because it's 1 less. It's the difference between this and this, which is a lot cleaner. Like this is just way better, and when you don't have to worry about selecting, multiple, when you have more than 12 units that you can select, it's obviously pretty important. So, yeah, I would say this is just that's just the way that we need to go, probably. What's up, Beaver? What's up, Loller Skates? What's up, Luciferius? Yeah, I think what Beaver says about it being a toggle is interesting as an idea for people who just prefer to be able to see the whole thing. The mock-up that I just showed, this one, with the counter, would probably be the default. And if people wanted to change it to the more conventional one, you could say, then they could in-game. I think that would be fine. So... yeah. I like where this is going. It's not useful, Vik, but it's still... it doesn't really matter if it's useful. It matters that we give the control to the people to make a stupid decision so that we can then laugh at them. There is also what Beaver says, which I was actually unironically considering, like, what if it shows you 12 units, like, what if it shows you, if you have less than a certain threshold of units, it shows you the conventional one, and then after you get past a certain amount, it just, like, collapses into the the categories. I don't really like that from the consistency standpoint, but if you have if you have control over it, like you bind a key to switch the setting or something, then that could be pretty cool. In fact, I think what Beaver mentions about it being something that you see on the terrain toggle over here or whatever. If we had like a set of customizable buttons that specifically change a setting, I think that could be kind of neat. It would almost be like having customizable mouse buttons on your mouse, but having them be part of the console where you decide like, okay, I'll get to choose what keybind activates it and what it actually does. So maybe by default, there's a button that toggles terrain. And then there's like, 4 other buttons or something. And sort of like the Warcraft 3 UI where there's like a list of circular buttons next to the minimap in the bottom left-hand corner. That sort of thing where you have like a couple of different options that you can click on to change something about it. Except obviously they wouldn't be like worried about creep camps or whatever because we don't really have that. But the idea of like being able to decide what you want on there and then quickly switching could be pretty useful. Like if somebody's got a kind of low-end PC, one example of this, and maybe this wouldn't really be that tenable, but if they have a low-end PC to the point where the early game and mid game runs fine, but they start chugging frames at the late game, like, okay, well then maybe they can have a custom bind that switches their in-game settings to low or something. I mean, I don't even know if we'll have settings, so I guess we'll just not draw certain things basically. Or maybe it would be like draw corpses for less time or something. But whatever the case may be, like if there were some setting that you could customize that you could throw on there, I think that would be fine. I wouldn't really have too much of an issue. So, yeah. So for what Beaver mentioned, like if somebody did want to switch between conventional and large scale, that would be something that I'd be totally down to facilitate that as an option, just because it's not really costing us anything. It's not creating inconsistency from a design perspective that the player has an advantage or disadvantage over other players really, and it's not like it's an automated system or anything. So yeah, corpses do have gameplay ramifications. They have they tell you some information, and they also clutter the battlefield. I don't know if corpses would ever get to the point where they're actually lagging the game, but I don't know. Like we have to test on a lot of hardware to figure out what does and doesn't lag. But I like the idea of being able to give people certain options. We'll decide what options actually are sensible to allow users to customize and what options we should make sure that are, for the sake of competitive integrity, we have to make sure that we have the right kinds of options and not like something that you can quickly toggle on to have something that's tantamount to cheating, basically. All right, I'll stew on that for a little bit and introduce you to the armor section of the Ansifii. So this comes from the Fulcrum, another definitely work in progress title. I might change it. I thought it was going to be really epic when I thought of it, but I don't know how many people even know what a Fulcrum is. So whatever, we'll figure that out later on. There is some bug where the gas doesn't show up, but it's not even ore and gas anyway. It's magmite and hyper vials. So, what's up, Walkinator? There are several corpse-oriented races, so corpses was a bad example of something that could be changed, but you get the idea. Is the Fulcrum actually like a name for a spaceship or an air fighter or something? A jet fighter? Anyway, we got the Fulcrum. It's for the turning of the gears, as the origin says, and it produces some armor. So the first is the Roadhog. Now, unfortunately, I don't think I can actually use Roadhog because this is going to sound super pedantic, but hogs are probably don't exist for the Ansifii, and if they do, they're probably not called hogs. So I can't really use this name, but it's the work in progress name, so I'll figure it out later. Ah, I'm missing gas Ansifii, I see. Yeah, I would just make it use the same icon for now. Probably the Protoss canister or something. Or maybe the Terran one. I don't know. Terran one's probably fine. You need to list more stuff on there, like movement speed. Yeah, I don't actually know what the movement speed... Like, the tough part is, like, as with all stats, really, without... Like, the stats are all almost, like, pointless until you get a feel for how... Like, maybe the how long a stat is, or like if it's build time, something like that, or maybe cooldown. But like range is almost completely useless. Damage is only useful insofar as you read more about damage and like what kinds of units have what kinds of vital stats as well as damage, then okay, that kind of tells you something. The damage types don't even have proper definitions. We're missing armor penetration and stuff like that. So there's a lot of fields that need to be added, as Chalk says. But there's also like not a whole lot of value in making sure that those are accurate until we get into the game and get a feel for what the stats actually feel like, particularly with regards to something like movement speed or, I mean, even attack speed, attack range, that sort of thing. Row dog. Yeah, there you go. Bulwark is a bit vanilla. I'd probably go for Bulwark for something like maybe like a structure or something like that. But we'll see. We'll see how that goes. I've got plenty of names to draw upon. I've just been trying to design the units themselves and then come up with like fitting names or whatever. What's up, Bethrelethal? These days, you don't know who somebody is unless they got the 3. Dude, that's like the Frauds Club code name, or not code name, secret code. Like, you know, you walk up to a door and you knock on the door and he's like, what's the passcode? Like, he opens up the little slit in the top. He goes, what is passcode? Because he's Russian. And then you go, yeah, you forgot to say hello. You know, everybody's got their own passcode for me to know who they are. But yeah, the trouble is, roller skates, that could be anybody. So the Roadhog is going to be an APC. It's going to have a very mediocre weapon, although it has a respectable range, but it's not really going to be massively impactful. It's mostly useful because it moves fast by comparison to Ansifii infantry, and that's what I wanted to push the initial units in general that are not infantry. The early tier units, like tiers 1 through 3, they're mostly going to be, if they're armor or orbital, they're going to be supportive in nature. There's going to be a couple that support via firepower. Like, we'll get into a couple of those in a second. But for the most part, like they're meant to be highly specific answers to specific threats, or they're meant to be supplementary in a way that, yeah, you build them very frequently. There's a lot of use cases for them, but it requires the infantry to do a lot of the heavy lifting. In either case, the infantry is going to do a lot of the heavy lifting, especially in the early tiers. And even the really high tier tech, like their giant tank platforms that carry structures into the battlefield, a lot of what's threatening about them is the fact that they can reinforce with high tier infantry in the same sort of area. You know what I mean? So a lot of what makes that very impactful is basically that. So with that being said, where else was I going with that? Oh yeah. I don't think there will be a mobile bunker type thing where you can shoot out of the vehicle until maybe the later tiers, like tier 3 probably. But the Roadhog will be like the predecessor to the APC. The Roadhog will be used for tiers 1 and 2, basically. When I'm looking at the units that I'm making concepts for, I'm expecting that unless they have a highly specific role, like what we'll get to in some of the orbital sections, I'm actually expecting that the units will only have a shelf life of about 2 tiers. Maybe 3 tiers, but for the most part, it's probably 2 tiers. And the reason for that is because while they might get a technical upgrade or something in the very next tier, maybe it comes out of a different structure, or maybe it's something that you can build alongside it somehow, like there's some synergy there. So you wouldn't completely replace it, you would just start to phase them out. And then after a second tier is unlocked, that's when you start to get to the point where, okay, there's not really much value, let me just move on to slapping my next one down. And what this is going to result in a lot of the time is that people are going to have to really balance how many production structures at lower tiers do they build, because eventually you're going to get another production structure, maybe 2 or 3 tiers down the line, that's going to outmode that, because those are the units you want to build, and that's how you spend the money that you're getting when you're at like 3, 4, 5 bases or whatever. So this is the kind of gameplay loop I'm already thinking about when designing the units, and the units themselves are also meant to, like I said, they have certain, based on the branch that there are and the regency that they're a part of, they have very specific goals or use cases, especially as stuff happens early on. So the Aurora, that's a familiar name. This is the first orbital unit. Comes out of the Omni Bay, which is going to be a very small and easily destroyable, a rather fragile production facility. That's not exactly inexpensive, but it's 100 hyperfiles. It's going to be reasonable. It's a little bit quicker to put down than the other production structures because it's a little bit smaller. And the idea is that you're going to throw these down for the sake of maybe you only need one or two in the early stages of the game, and you're mostly getting them for scouting potential and maybe answering to specific threats that require you to be a little bit faster. So the Aurora in this case is going to be a light fighter craft. I'm probably going to drop... Oh no, this one I think the vitals are probably fine, or at least approximate. But the idea is that they're fairly basic units. They're just your traditional fighter. These guys aren't going to be the heavy hitters, but they might be able to harass or distract an enemy while the infantry move up and gain some ground. And they obviously are going to be able to chase down enemies that move a little bit faster than your infantry. And in that sense, they can support you a little bit more. We're going to move on to the Dispute. Now, the Dispute is pretty epic. It has Observance, which is not the ability from the Seraph in Cosmonarchy Brood War. It's actually just my version of Detection. So you will see all hidden targets within this unit's line of sight. The reason why I used line of sight and not vision radius is obviously if it's a ground unit and your view is obstructed by like a structure or maybe some ability that blocks vision, they won't be able to actually see the unit, so it will still remain hidden. And then there's Shroud Pierce Sensors. So notably, this is a weaponless craft. I will probably be dropping its HP a little bit to maybe 50. The idea is that even though it's not massively expensive, it is very useful, but very fragile, so that it's almost like it'll move faster than the Witness, for example, in Cosmonarchy Brood War, or the Observer if you're from just regular Brood War. But the idea is that you're going to be tagging units with this debuff that reveals them through Fog of War. It doesn't share vision with them. But if you tag a unit, say you tag a production structure, you can then look at it through the Fog of War and see, for one, did it move, if it can move? For another, is it lighting up? Is it producing something? Is it actually animating in a specific way? And you'll be able to, decide certain information based on that. Obviously, people are going to want to fly this over resource lines to tag workers, see if they go to expand somewhere. That would be pretty ideal for them, obviously. This is like an AoE parasite type thing from, if you remember back to Brood War, with the Queen/Matroleth being able to parasite stuff, that sort of thing. Except, again, it's just revealing the unit itself. It's not revealing the like anything near it or anything. So you're sort of seeing through the shroud in that sense. Obviously, it's cleansed. It can be cleansed itself as any debuff can. But if the Dispute that tagged them is destroyed, you also lose access to it. So that's why it's imperative to keep the Dispute alive after doing that. Now, I'm not sure if this is just going to result in people like running through a base, tagging units, and then flying their Dispute out of dodge and trying to protect it. I had the idea to play around with a little bit of like an inverse, where if your Dispute has tagged something, then it is also revealed to the opponent. But even then, that might not be that useful. So we'll have to see. It might just end up being a kind of fire and forget type unit in that respect. But I feel like it'll still be very interesting and thematic and useful for Ansifii players in the early stages of the game. So we'll have to play around with that idea. Tracking is a mechanic that you are allowed to use in gameplay if you would want. It's basically showing units through Fog of War without allowing targeting or checking stats. That kind of tracking would probably be what I want for specifically this Shroud Pierce sensor ability, and probably for some other things as well. So yeah, you're basically being able to track the units makes sense to me. Well, Hoop Thrower, first of all, welcome. Second of all, it's not really like Parasite because Parasite revealed you if you were cloaked, which I'm not actually sure if hidden units will be caught on this. They probably will. But it also revealed the vision radius of that unit. You inherited the vision radius. In this case, you're only being seen through the fog. And as Veek sort of hints in the YouTube chat, you're not going to be able to select the unit, check its stats or anything. You'll just see what animations it's playing and where it is on the map. So it'll be revealed to you in the mini-map as well in terms of the position. So it's a little bit more on the side of like lighter on the information side. But yeah, it's something like that. It will be a nice competence / awareness check for enemies because they're not going to want to expand with a worker that's been sighted in this method. So they would want to train a new worker to do that. But besides that, I'm not 100% sure. It sounds really cool initially. It does make me feel like maybe the the dispute just like flies away afterwards and tries to stay alive for as long as possible. But there will be a decent number of cleansing mechanics in the game, so I'm not really worried about it being too binary. And you do also have to allow it to hover over your units for 5 seconds, so it can kind of play around cliffs a little bit, but I don't think it would get massive impact unless, you know, you just don't have any anti-air whatsoever, and you also didn't scout it, so... Yeah, the line of sight detection, in my opinion, was basically like, or in my estimation, my sort of imagination, if you will, was like you could have maybe some sort of shroud. Like I think the Nadarasatha are going to have this a lot because their whole thing is built around blocking out sunlight, right? So they would probably have these mobile shrouds that literally like block vision into what's inside them. And you could fire inside to target the shroud generator or whatever that is, but you wouldn't necessarily be able to like see what else is in there. And obviously, like maybe your bullets get intercepted by something else or whatever. Control Shift X flips the chat. What does that even mean? Balefell mentioned earlier that it would be probably a good idea to disassemble or upgrade production structures. I think in general, just because we have so many tiers, that there will be some way for all regencies to either upgrade or salvage, scuttle their old stuff. Even if it doesn't give them resources, just being able to clear out the build space would be sufficient. The trouble is, I don't know what that would actually entail. It's actually a really big, like, powerful attribute to have, in my opinion, to be able to do that. So I don't want to just have a sell button like in Command and Conquer, for example. I feel like that's, for one, that always destroyed the immersion for me because you're somehow like buildings are just crumbling because I clicked on them. Or the delete key in Age of Empires. That's probably, that's not as sound an argument, but that was like always my visceral reaction. So I wouldn't really want it on those subjective interests. But my more objective take is that you really don't want to be you don't want to be sat in a situation where the only thing you need to do once you've attained a higher tier is just push a couple of buttons. You want to actually have there be a cost to overbuilding a low tier production structure, and that cost has got to be in your mind. So if you've overbuilt certain structures that are no longer as useful, do you keep them around in case your tier goes down or in case you can't afford the higher tier units? Do you scavenge them for any resources or the build space or whatever? And if you do decide to scavenge them, I think you probably should have to specifically tech into a unit that scavenges them, like a higher tier worker or something that maybe you wouldn't have used otherwise. Maybe you would. Maybe it's incidental depending on the regency. But I think that would be a trait of like a tier 3 Ansifii worker, for example. And considering the roots of the Ansifii, I think it makes sense for them to actually get some resources back from doing that. I guess I would have a bit of an issue with like making it only work on their structures. I would kind of want it to be able to work on hostile structures and allied structures too, even though that is, you know, especially with the allied one, it's begging for griefing. But you know what? I don't really think that's something that should impede design. I feel like if you're griefing, it's because you're a bad teammate and people will just report you. Yeah, there's like, you'd basically make it so that there's no punishment for, like I said, overbuilding something. So that's not really what we want. We'll move on to tier 2. We got the Constable. He's a leader infantry. He's going to lead the charge most often. He's got reasonable armor and vitals. He's got 2 weapons, one of them being melee. And already at tier 2, we're seeing a chronal damage dealer. So keep your eye on this guy. He's going to deal full damage to everything with his fist. And as well as obviously having a shoulder gun that will fire off at nearby targets. So the secondary attack of the Constable can fire while in motion. This allows him to be able to shoot at stuff even if it's an air unit or whatever, where his ground attack can only target, or his melee attack can only target ground units. So this guy is, I'm not sure what he'll require exactly. There'll be some extra shit that you have to build either as an add-on to the gallery or a separate structure. But he's basically going to be, you can see he's not really a replacement for the Maverick. He's more of like a unique type of unit. And this is where we're getting into the idea that the shelf life of a given unit is probably about 2 tiers, and because tier 3 will show up with something that's a bit more of a deliberate upgrade over the Maverick as a unit. The next unit is the Strong Arm. This guy is a crowd control type character. He's got the Volt Thrower, which is obviously it's not obvious, I guess. It's a reference to an epic metal band from the 90s, Bolt Thrower. I don't know if that'll stick, but it does concussive damage, and when it tags units, half of that concussive damage is dealt to all targets within 2 range, immediately following 1 second. So this is a bit of a shade of the Cyclops passive, if you guys are familiar with that in Cosmonarchy Brood War. So you can imagine tagging people and having that spark happen right after. It doesn't stack insofar as multiple tags are not going to increase the damage, they're just going to cause subsequent damages. And his cooldown is conveniently 1 second as well. So he can tag you and then hit you again as the secondary tag is popping off. And I guess your corpse will explode a second later too if you die. Yeah, I don't know. Like, I'm hoping that I will just like, I'm actually hoping to, this is a bit crazy and probably unpopular. I'm hoping that people will just not feel as inclined to be ridiculous in a game that actually respects their time. But I don't know how successful that's going to be. I probably underestimate how ridiculous people really are. I think if, like, the reason why, for example, League of Legends is toxic, quote unquote, is actually because League of Legends is just a bad game. It's not because, like, a disproportionate amount of toxic people flock to the game. And again, toxic as a term is just so useless at this point, in my opinion. It doesn't even really describe anything because you can be labeled toxic for just telling somebody that they should get better at the game. And maybe you don't say that in the most respectful way, but you even just saying GG easy at the end of a game can get you fucking reported these days. And in a way where the reports actually have merit and you might end up getting chat restricted or whatever. This didn't happen to me personally, but I've heard of people getting that, and maybe they were all fluffing it, and that didn't really happen. But Riot has gone on the record saying that they didn't want people typing GG easy, that was a form of toxicity. So I just think that the whole term is useless. But League of Legends itself, as an example of a game where people are always typing shit, always getting angry, always just raging at their keyboards and foaming at their mouths, I think it's like that because it's just a bad game. And the competitive ladder, is not constructed in a way that's actually rewarding and respectful of players' times. I guess they changed some of these elements, but the fact that for the longest time, if you were playing ranked and you were in a promotional series, and maybe this is still the case, your teammates may not have been in a promotional series. So suddenly you as a player who are playing to try to rank up, and maybe this is your 3rd time trying to rank up to the next division, you're in a game that has completely different stakes to the other guy who's like mid-table LP. He's got 50 LP or whatever. He's got plenty to burn before he has to be in danger of actually giving a shit and playing the game properly. And so he decides, well, this game doesn't matter to me, so I'll throw. Like, that's of course going to make you so fucking annoyed at the game. And that encourages toxicity. That's the way that this shit actually happens. That's how people start losing their fucking minds, because it's a team game, but the game doesn't matter the same to all people. So of course you're going to get this problem crop up where, for one, people are just doing things in accordance with how much the game matters to them. And for another, that disparity is going to engender a lot of actual toxicity, of people being very angry and foaming at their mouths. Nothing they can do. It's just ridiculous. Because what are you going to say to the guy? Can you just try harder for me? Like, if you've already lost rapport because you didn't gank the guy, or he threw, a kill or something and you called him out, or whatever the case may have been, it maybe nothing bad happened. Just asking somebody to try more than they were already planning to try is not guaranteed to succeed, even if you do it very respectfully and nicely. So, like, the systems are designed for you to fail and become toxic, yet they had people trying to figure out why their game was causing this much shit. Or really, they would never say that it was causing that. They would say, why are players of our game? Why are they being toxic in our game? Now, I'm not saying League of Legends is the only game where toxicity happens. Far from it. But it does seem like it's a real petri dish for the worst kinds of toxicity. The actual toxicity of games where people are just raging for the specific purpose of trying to make you feel bad about yourself. And they're lashing out in that way, in my opinion, in large part due to the fact that the competitive ladder is just a shit show and always has been designed against players' interests, against players playing as a team, against the interest of actual team cohesion. It's been designed. The fact that we have games of those games, like matches of those games, where people are playing as a team, that's the exception. That's crazy. That's like looking at the number of cars that people drive and saying, holy shit, I can't believe they're not more wrecks. You know, that's the same thing that I think when I look at the League of Legends ladder. Like, how are there so many reasonable, tolerable games? How are there so many people who haven't already succumbed to it? It's crazy. It doesn't surprise me in the slightest that there's a lot of people who have gone down that route. I'll say that much. It's still the case, says Beaver. Veek says it's getting worse. Yeah, pretty hilarious. Yeah. So the game design certainly influences it. People in the chat talking about stuns and just being able to disallowed to play the game at all. Like, that is ridiculous. And that's also like, remember that the root of them continuing to release champions instead of assessing the design flaws of their game currently and all of the champions that are currently in it is money. It's the additional skins that they're going to be able to make, the fact that they're going to release these champions that are generally busted for 2 weeks so that everybody comes in and starts buying the champion with RP or whatever they're called. I think they have essences or something because the Haka invaded them in StarCraft 2 Void. But yeah, people are never going to take responsibility regardless of the game state because of the fact that there is a diffusion of responsibility with your teammates doing something that you didn't agree with because you guys aren't on the same page. And I think a large part of that is due to the whole ranked situation where when you're playing you're playing to win. Not everybody, first of all, who's queuing ranked is actually playing to win. And that's their own fault. And those people should actually just be queuing normals. It's like they don't really want to put in all the effort. So that part is personal responsibility. You are going to have a degree of that. That's always going to fuck with people. Some people just want to troll. Some people, maybe they don't want to troll, but they're not really opposed to it if it comes down to it. And if you give them enough of an excuse, which is so subjective that it's impossible to really know. Now, that being said, even if that's the case, like there's that element of personal responsibility that some people don't take and don't rise to the occasion, there is the case to be made that when you're queuing in and you're all trying to win a game of ranked League of Legends, again, it goes back to what my earlier point was, that you're not trying to the same degrees, because one guy's in his promotional series to the next entire ranking, what do they call it, division, like going from silver to gold or something. Somebody else is maybe in game 2 of their promo series and they won the previous one. They could take their foot off the gas a little bit and coast, and it doesn't really matter as much if they lose because they've got another game that they can play, and that's just to move up from like silver 3 to 4 or whatever, or I guess it would be the other way around. And then 3 other people in the game aren't even in promos, they're just grinding up for regular LP. Like, okay, you've sorted people into a game state where they just have completely different interests and different things motivating them. Theoretically, they would all want to win, but they don't all want to win to the same degree. I always found it hilarious that Riot didn't find some way to fix this, because it's not unfixable. It's just they don't want to put in the effort, apparently. Yeah, one thing I would like to see in Cosmonarchy in general is the ability to, like, I think this is actually something we should just have a default. I don't know what you guys think about this, but I would like the idea of when you queue into ranked and you're waiting to find a match, as you're queuing, the game in the background launches a test map to help you warm up, and like you fight against the AI in a 1v1 or something. And you have like control over like what rate, like it defaults to your previous race, but you can just restart the session at any time by like picking your race or whatever. And then you can have like a settings option for like warm up. Like, first of all, you can turn it off if you don't want to. And second of all, you can do like, you can just configure what it is. I really like the idea of just throwing you right in. Like maybe instead of it being default always on, it would be like, it would prompt you to like configure warm up and start it, and then there's a tick box that says like automatically launch into warm up when I queue or whatever. But I like the idea of just instantly being able to start like warming up or whatever before the a proper match starts. And I think that's way better. Like CS:GO had this recent update, within the last year, where they gave you a bunch of 1v1 warm up arenas. The trouble is that the arenas look nothing like, they look like the map, but they play nothing like the map. It's just random pieces of cover and props from the map. But it's not the same geometry. It's not like they've like put you in one spot on a bomb site and had you like duel with somebody who's going to enter into the bomb site so you can start to like remember the angles and stuff. It's just like completely different geometry. So that's obviously bad. And they didn't really give people an opportunity to like queue into them. So you can't say like, oh, actually, I would just like to run around the map normally. So whatever, that's a poor implementation, we'll say. But I like the idea of being able to actually be playing against an opponent in a more constrained environment and practice things that you're going to be doing very soon or whatever. Yeah, people did talk a little bit about the items, but I don't know anything about them. Anyway, I like the idea of being able to do some sort of warm-up thing for sure. And I also like the idea of maybe having a public like queue into. Well, I guess this would probably make a bit more sense in Continuum or something. I don't know. But the idea of being able to like queue into a warm-up or something would be pretty neat. But I guess that's not really that different than just queuing into normal 1v1, like unranked 1v1. Well, yeah, the tough part is, Veek, if you don't want to participate, it's annoying. If the guy you've been sorted into a match with doesn't want to participate, it's also annoying because now you're just looking at somebody who's AFK. Like, what the fuck is the point? Well, I think it would say, like, in big word text up top, like, entering warm-up or something. And then there would still be, like, a matchmaking thing that you could access if you hit escape that shows you, like, your queue time and all that shit. But yeah, for the sake of clarity, I think at first it would prompt you to configure it, and you could just jump right in. Yeah, StarCraft 2 tried to do that with, like, weird stats, like how many workers you trained or something. But it was not, I don't know how useful it actually was. But that was one of the least offensive things that they tried, I guess. I did like that they gave you the option to hide losses or something from your profile. I think it was only in certain cases. I don't think it was in matchmaking. But it's like hide unranked losses in your profile was like an option. Because people were getting really upset that they were feeling personally attacked, that their match history showed when they were practicing an off race or whatever. You know, that's another thing that triggers people in League too. Before they even get into it, right? Before they even get into the game, they have this very lengthy pick ban phase, during which point anyone can dodge. I'm pretty sure it takes like 5, maybe 6 minutes or something crazy to actually get through that. Maybe I'm overselling it. Maybe it's a little bit shorter. Either way, though, it's a repeated work that you're always doing. And it's just, this is your time to theoretically talk with your teammates and say, hey, what's going on? How's everybody doing today? What is the strat we want to run, etc. But nobody really uses it for that, really. They're just like, ban Mongo. I don't even know any champs. Mundo. There you go. Mundo's kind of Mongo. Ban Mundo. That's what they say. So I feel like if you're going to make a game where you have so many different champions, I think there's a reason why people just one trick, so that they can reduce the overhead and like the information overload that they get. Now, this is rich coming from a guy who's going to make a game with 2,000 units, but if you're in a situation where people are maining something, one-tricking something, and then getting super tilted when that something is banned by them, or by their team or their opposing team, that's you've lost, man. You've lost. Now, I don't know if we'll even have a pick ban set up. I feel like we probably will for Xibalba, for Cosmonarchy, but it's just hilarious to me to see that. It's just it's so funny. Yeah, I remember when they moved from 3 bans to 5, because 3, by the way, and then 5 is obviously the second cousin of 3, and then 7 is probably where they'll go next, because that's the third cousin of 3, because 3. But it's not really fixing the problem. Like, I think realistically speaking, they need to find some way to speed up the pick ban phase in general. I don't know. When I was originally drafting the concept for Cosmonarchy's pro circuit, if I was going to have one, assuming we get enough interest to have one, I guess you could say. I didn't spend too much time thinking about this, because obviously you don't want to give the impression that you're planning an esport, because esports aren't planned, they just happen. And they happen if your game is the right combination of good, lucky, and saleable, marketable. Now, I think we'll get good and we might even get lucky, but I don't know how saleable an RTS will be. We'll see. The idea of a pro scene, a pro circuit where pros are actually playing the game, I did think of a rotation where every 6 months, one race goes in, one race goes out. And it coincides with some map pool changes or whatever. And so I did have the idea that maybe something like that would happen. And so maybe you'd have 4 or 6 races, regencies available by depending on how many total regencies you had, and that would expand the pick ban as well. So, like, for example, if you were coming in, if you were playing on retail and we had this sort of pro circuit setup, then you would probably have a pool of 4 regencies. So only 4 of the 6 retail regencies would be playable in competitive, at least at the pro level. And then there wouldn't really even be a pick ban probably. Or there would be all 6, but there would be a pick ban. So you'd like each, if it was a 1v1 or a team game, they could like ban one or the other. They could each ban one. Maybe instead it would be a map pool ban instead of worrying about regency pick bans. And then that could develop into its own kind of meta where if you ban this map or you pick this map, then you know statistically like certain regencies are better on that map, or this team is better with this regency combination on this map specifically, something like that. And then obviously I really want to experiment with the idea of asymmetric competitive maps, which is going to be bizarre and maybe won't work at all. But if that did happen, then they would have to like coin flip for the side. Or if you pick the map, then the other guy picks the side. Something like that could be kind of interesting. Like he gets to pick his spawn first or whatever. Either way, I like the idea of the rotation. I also think, pick ban is probably fine, but it is something that we would need to consider over time, and we probably don't want to bother doing any of that when we're busy making the game in the first place. So, but it is something that I have put some thought into. All right, we got 2 more units to get through, and then I got to actually write some stuff and do some work. What's up, Shambleman? Right now we're looking at the Ansifii, and after that we'll be writing some more information on mechanics, and then we'll be doing more work on Ansifii unit ideas. So this is the Cutlass. This is your siege tank equivalent, except it doesn't deal AoE damage, you see. It is a precision striker. And it has this behavior called stable stance, which allows cutlasses to entrench into the surrounding terrain. They become immobilized and they double their range from 6 to 12. 6 being, I think, the highest range we have currently planned in the Ansifii tech tree. So already a reasonable, respectable range. It's the same range as the Roadhog's default rifle, default attack. And yeah, so this bad boy is basically here for precise strikes, and it deals explosive damage, so you'll be using it against buildings, heavy vehicles, that sort of stuff. It only attacks ground. It is your early artillery unit, but you can see why it would not be used against crowds of small units, against small units in general, like we'll say light armored units, that sort of thing. So still very supportive in nature. You can't win a fight with only cutlasses unless your opponent really misplayed their hand and didn't have anything to even approach a counter in their composition. So I think that's a reasonable take on a siege tank. I like the idea that it's not AoE, but still has the same sort of siege up mode. Maybe I'll allow them to move slower while in that instead of being completely immobilized. I don't know, but I feel like it's probably fine for them to immobilize. Kind of cool. Moving on, we got the Path Sign. So the Path Sign is a different unit. It's a different air unit. This orbital craft is essentially here for area denial, map control. So the idea is that instead of actually attacking a unit directly, the way most units do, these guys will channel their weapon to the terrain below them and just create this field of persistent fire below them. And it will spread out in a radius of 1, 2, and 3, as you can see, for the area of effect. So it's a fairly linear radius in that sense. I mean, we're not really going to have the AoE that Brood War had anyway, so that's kind of besides the point. But the idea is that it's going to spread out to a modest distance, but you're going to want to fly these relatively fast units over enemies and deploy them on the spot, or task them onto specific units or whatever, and then they will channel it, and you can order them to move around. I guess the other thing that I was thinking about is that these units might be able to attack while moving a little bit, or channel their weapon while moving, so you could literally do like these slower running paths back and forth, and they would literally like blaze their trail through the through like a certain area. You could like task them to patrol or something over a mineral line. That would be kind of funny. I don't know if I'll do that for this unit. That might be like the next upgrade version that can like do this while moving. If we decide to have this be an upgraded unit in the first place, because it is a little bit more of a specialist unit, you could say, in terms of the purpose that it has. But yeah, that's basically the concepts. Those are basically the concepts that I have. The general look is coming along. We have 7 of the presumed 10 units that we expect to have for tier 1. I think I'll probably do 1 more armor, 1 more infantry, and then maybe another infrastructure or orbital unit. But we might also not have... we might have 2 more infantry, actually. So we'll see how that works out. I was also thinking a little bit about this note that I put in for the text or the tech tree map outline, where I would expect 10 total units, 7 to 8 of which are combat units, and 2 to 3 of which are utility units. We already have 2 utility units for the Ansifii in the Dispute and obviously the Mason, and the rest of them being combat units in some way, shape, or form. And you could kind of make an argument that the Roadhog is a bit of a mix. However, when it comes to the idea of this being on average, I do mean on average. I think, for example, specifically the... I didn't note this down, but I was thinking like 4 structures. And the reason why 4 structures is because I'm expecting an average of 40 per regency, and you've got 10 tech tiers. However, there will probably be, 5-6 structures in tier 1 for most regencies, just because it's the start of things. So you're going to have a static defense structure at tier 1. You're going to have maybe some sort of utility structure at tier 1, and maybe you're going to have some add-ons or some sort of tech structure. Those would probably be affixed in tier 2 instead, but you get the idea. There's going to be at least, 1 more structure that I add to the Ansifii's tier 1, insofar as there has to be some sort of defense structure. And there will probably be a utility structure, maybe at tier 2, that is meant for, what would you call it? Like detection, observance in this game state. But yeah, that's the idea. Dude, the screenshot of the chat you sent me is insane. What have you done, Veek? Well, that was messy. How exactly will splash be changing? So the outer radius of the splash is going to be 1%. Like the outermost pixel is 1% of damage. The innermost is 100% of damage. That's it. It's just a linear fall off. Now the thing is, this sounds like you can only have one kind of splash, but you can just define that the inner and the outer are the same if you want complete damage. You can define that the inner is half of the outer, which means that from everything from point of origin to halfway out to the outer side is full damage, and then you get the drop off. So there's a lot of freedom that you still have with that, and it should cover all of our use cases while also being way more consistent than... Oh, the classic example is the siege tank in siege mode, where it hits you with a splash attack, and then a unit that's like looks visibly similar in terms of distance to another unit will take more or less damage because they were a couple pixels off. So we obviously don't want that. So it won't be more immediately noticeable or intuitive, I guess you could say, in terms of like, oh, I took 53% of damage, and I know that and what that is because I was 53% in the outer radius or so. Like that obviously isn't going to make as much sense on an intuitive level, but I feel like it will be more intuitive in terms of how much damage you are actually taking. It might not make as much immediate sense to players. Well, no, I still think it'll make more immediate sense to players than Blizzard's method of Splash. But as far as it being a perfect system, I'm not even sure if it's possible to make something more intuitive than that. But if there is, I don't know it. It's just going to be way more consistent in terms of the actual outcome of a splash attack landing in a batch of units than what Brood War is. And since we're playing around with a larger scale and more units and more weapons than Brood War ever had, you are obviously going to be running into more cases that in Brood War were only edge cases, but in our game are going to be a bit more common. And even if they are still edge cases, it's still important to note that we've addressed them to some extent. So, speaking of addressing stuff, for anybody who's joined us after my intro, we do have a mechanics section where I go over what we have and what we have not. And what we have not is supply, upgrades, and smart casting. I will have more things added to that list as time goes on. For now, I do want to make a section on selection. And we'll see where that goes. I guess selection doesn't really make as much sense because it's more of a user interface thing, isn't it? But I think we can do armor and weapons, armor penetration. Yeah, here it is. I had made the setting or the section already. So we'll mention weapons, armor, and penetration. This is where we can mention splash damage as well, since that was asked earlier. So we'll just put a note here for... Maybe we'll say that instead of 1%, it's 10%. So you always take a little bit of notable damage. But I don't know. Then it's not exactly linear, but might still be more intuitive. This is something we can iterate on. So we'll note that at the end. Now, Veek, if you would be so kind as to remind me, if you even know, I actually am failing to immediately recall what system we were going for with the splash. Like, did we decide on, or not splash? Armor pen. I forget if I know we have armor pen as a stat. Maybe I'll remember on my own. Armor pen as a stat for sure, as like an additional stat on the weapon. But then there was also dedicated armor pen based on weapon type. So light damage had more armor pen to, or no, concussive damage had more armor pen to light armor. So it had an innate like 1 or 2 armor pen, for example. We would have to decide that as a constant. And then you had additional like individual units that had their own armor pen. What I can't remember is if we decided that armor pen would be consistently like, there would be a cutoff point where more armor pen does not equal more damage. So if you have, for example, a unit with 2 armor and you have 3 armor pen against them, do you deal 1 extra damage? I think not. I think we just dealt full damage in that case. We ignored the armor. So if armor pen is greater than armor, you always ignore it. I don't think you do more damage though. I think that's what we had decided on, which was supposed to rule out some edge cases. This is again just what I remember. So, see you later, Loler. I think maybe instead of armor pen, like, I guess excess armor pen could pierce shields or something, but that doesn't, that's a mechanic that would only apply to certain cases. So basically just hamstring certain units, certain regencies that have shields, or certain units that have shields if they're a part of that. You could put armor pen only on weapons, in terms of it being, so you could put the mechanic only on weapons, but if you do that, it's not as, I feel like it's not as automatic as like, so you're saying like, but you're basically suggesting to remove the whole concussive grants you +2 to light. That, for one, that wouldn't actually be the same thing. Because if you have a 0 armor pen weapon, but it deals concussive damage, it will still deal full damage to, say if it's +2 armor pen to light, and you're attacking a light unit, you'll deal full damage even if it has 2 armor. So you'll ignore up to 2 armor, I should say. Whereas if it's explosive, and you're targeting a light unit, and it has 2 armor, you're not going to be dealing damage. Well, that's what I was just saying earlier, Shambleman, is that if you have more armor pen than there is armor, it still doesn't deal more damage. It just ignores all armor. Yes, because the +2 pen on concussive weapons would ignore, so it would ignore armor on units that are not light. Maybe I'm the one missing something here. So if we have a ghost, I wrote this out earlier. I actually documented this somewhere. I can't remember where it was though. I think it was in the design folder here. Materials, design. No, that's an AI command we never made. Date modified. Fuck. It's not here either. Nope, I have no idea where it is then. Maybe I wrote this in the Regencies folder. Oh, here it is. I did it. I figured it out. Armor penetration. So we took the Eidolon, for example. It has 10 base damage and 2 armor pen. Concussive means it ignores 2 armor of light attackers, 1 of medium, 0 of heavy/titanic, which means it has Eidolon v Phalanx, which has heavy class, 10 minus 2, because the Phalanx has 2 armor, +2, which is from armor pen, +0 from concussive. So it ignores the armor, because it has the 2 armor pen innate to the weapon. Now, if you, here you have Elite Maverick. I don't know why I decided Elite, but I guess I was meaning like it was going to be tier 5 Maverick or something. It has 5 armor, but light armor class. Then we have 10 minus 5, +2, +2. So you can see that the armor pen bonus is dependent on the armor class of the opponent. Well, I guess the weapon class of you and armor class of the opponent. The relationship. So you have armor pen as a stat, and then you have an additional stat that adds armor pen if you're targeting the right unit type. Now, the question is, do we even want those kinds of changes? Because the thing is, this is a replacement for the system that just put a percentage on your damage if you were targeting a different armor class. I don't like that system because it's percentage based as opposed to being flat. So it's harder to immediately intuit what's going on. And then you're thinking like, oh, I'm shooting this unit with a Maverick that deals 5 damage. Except it's dealing 3 damage because it's a heavy unit or something. You know what I mean? Like, you don't really want that. So instead it would be like, the armor pen thing would allow you to ignore more armor and be more useful as a lower tier unit against a higher tier unit of a specific armor class, which on its face sounds like it would be kind of rock, paper, scissorsy or hard countery. But I think in practice, considering the number of units we're going to have, this actually would be fine. And it would lend to certain units feeling broadly, certain classes of units feeling broadly useful against other certain classes of units, even past their normal traditional expiry date. The question is, do we even want that? Like, that's something that I have to continue figuring out. But this is basically the system over time that I'm thinking. Now, the idea of having high armor pen, high base armor pen, kind of means that the class-based would be pointless. But you also have to remember, we have the ideas of having way higher armor values than traditional RTS games tend to have, where we have like units that are going to be walking around with 10 armor or 20 armor or something. Like double-digit armors are going to be fairly common in the past tier 4, tier 5. So because of that, we expect this armor penetration mechanic to continue to scale up as armor values themselves scale up in terms of how useful it is. And that makes the concussive, heavy, that sort of stuff, like the different kinds of armor pen, or the different kinds of penetration weapon classes, you could say. That does make it a bit weird that it's flat instead of being something that scales, because the base bonus does not scale. But I still think it'll be impactful in early game situations. And admittedly, like I guess you could, if you were going to remove any part of it, you would remove the part that is related to the weapon class, but then you don't have any changes whatsoever to a unit attacking another unit based on perceived armor durability, shall we say. Oh, I guess you're factoring in upgrades, yeah. I was wondering, like, what the fuck? Well, the weapon class specifically, that thing specifically would become outscaled, but the armor pen itself wouldn't, because armor is scaling up, as I was just saying. So I guess what we could do instead of having armor class types is just have high base armor, even at tier 1. And we work it all into armor instead of types. So that way, if we want a unit to be considered heavy or titanic, we would just give it a lot of base armor. And if we want it to be considered light or medium, we would give it lower amounts of base armor. And then it's always a consistent, like, you don't have to factor in anything based on weapon type, which might be a little bit more, better overall. So then if you don't have any armor pen and you're fighting a unit that has 10 armor, you're not going to be doing any damage to it if you don't have more than like a heavy hitting attack. And even then, there's a lot of other problems. So Beaver asks if there are indeed plans on having shields similar to Protoss. It's not 100% the same. Shield piercing weapon type that would ignore shields and just damage the unit's health. I think, like I was thinking about that, like maybe excess armor, like I just mentioned, like excess armor pen would ignore shields, or it would bleed through the shields or something. I never really liked that Plague ignored shields in the first place. I actually changed it in Cosmonarchy Brood War anyway. So I am not sure about that one specifically. But hold on, I just have to put some music on. There is... Why is it so hot still? What the fuck? Fuck his armor counter pen. Yeah, I think maybe conceptualizing the armor pen to be on the projectile instead of on the weapon is actually healthier in general, because there's going to be things like enchanting a weapon to get more armor pen if it passes through this field. And that way you'd be interacting with the projectile specifically. I'm not sure that it would. I guess I would need to see some math or something, but I can't immediately see any uses for it. That doesn't mean it's not useful, but all right. I like the idea though. I like the idea of just dropping the weapon and armor classes, because that is more confusion. And having armor penetration instead just makes it seem a lot more reasonable. So I think we'll go with that. Chox has indeed convinced me. And I convinced myself by looking at the math and realizing it's not really that epic. Especially after you abstract it out of a few scales. Like, oh, when you have 10 armor, don't worry. In addition to this 2 armor that you have, you also have 2 more armor. Like, fuck off, dude. Like the orders of magnitude here are completely off for the for its utility. Doesn't scale well. So, weapons in Xibalba deal, we'll say fire projectiles that have both damage and armor penetration stats that interact with their targets. Should they strike an enemy, the victim's armor reduces the incoming damage unless it is unless this armor stat is lower than the projectile's armor penetration stat, in which case, make this a hyphen, in which case the armor is completely ignored. Well, I think you can kind of do that already with I don't know that would be very clean. I think if we wanted a unit that could withstand ridiculous quantities of small arms fire, we would just have it have in addition to high armor, have high health. I don't know about the idea of dealing 1 damage every second attack, the way Brood War has it, which was a way to make it so that you could still deal trickling, tiny, tony amounts of damage to units. I think maybe the idea that a projectile cannot deal less than 1 damage is probably fine. Which would essentially double that mechanic that that Brood War had. Yeah, dude. I think it's still unreasonable to expect that like even 100 Ansifii Mavericks would ever deal with like a star. What is it? Solar Throne fucking Star Sovereign or like it just walks up with like 30 armor. I don't think you're going to be killing that thing with Mavericks anyway. Like in the time it takes for you to do that, you would enter into the heat death of the universe. I think impervious to damage is just a bit scary for like edge cases. Now, I could say I'm confident enough that there will be no such edge cases that where this outcome is not desired, but we are dealing with 2,000 fucking units, so I don't know if I'm actually that confident in that. That being said, if those situations did come up, I would have to think about how to resolve that on a per unit balancing level. It just gets a lot more messy. So I think this is probably a fine little thing where it's not like it's a real like a gimmick or anything. It's just your damage is minimum 1, so at least you know that. So it's not like it's completely pointless to fight, but depending on the case, it's certainly more pointless, more oftentimes than not. More often than not. Yeah. Dude, it's going to be pretty epic to see the levels of stats that we get up to. Besides buildings, I don't think we ever got to see a unit that actually has 1,000 health. But in a system like this, it actually is like you can justify it. You know what I mean? Because there's ways to penetrate it with like high. There's going to be attacks that deal hundreds of damage. So I am a little bit cautious about going super far into those scales because if you ever are in a situation where you feel like you have to abbreviate damage numbers, you've lost. You lost the fucking game. But I do like the idea of playing around with a couple of outliers that have these kinds of statistics. And then you kind of save them for very memorable moments. Okay, so I've noted here that projectiles have their own health and armor, and that splash damage that is on the same plane as the projectile will deal damage to projectiles. Ability effects and special weapons are able to target normal projectiles, and large projectiles are able to be targeted by conventional weapons. So we have a whole host of ways to engage with projectiles directly. Now, the reason why I wanted to push this idea personally is that I've always liked the idea of. Hold on. I had to note that every weapon has a projectile, even if it's very fast. I wanted to note that I wanted to have the idea of like a couple of energy field abilities or some sort of like anti-missile defense system that like a point laser drone thing that instead of just like in the Raven in StarCraft 2, it just eats projectiles all day. And I guess it costs energy or something, but it's just a flat cost, I'm pretty sure, if it even does cost that. It just seems so lame. It's like, nah, how about it deals damage, and then if you have enough projectiles coming, or if you have, I don't know, like a heavy projectile that takes a lot of HP, like it has a lot of HP and it has a lot of armor. Like, oh, suddenly your point defense lasers ain't doing shit, homie. Like they'll get it down half HP, but it'll still hit. That sort of stuff. And then there's going to be stuff that like slows weapons or increases their stats or whatever. What is PDD? Oh, point defense room. I don't even remember what the Predator was. Isn't the Predator a cat? Isn't it like a Power Rangers joke? Oh, wait, no, that was in Heart of the Swarm. The Predator was actually a unit. Pretty funny. I think is that called a Predator? Why do I know that? Get StarCraft 2 out of my head. Get it out. Oh, they just reused the name. Pretty generic name, I guess. Yeah, I feel like dealing damage to projectiles is something that is pretty easy to conceptually come up with, but I'm kind of surprised I haven't seen that. Like, they don't want to. Developers tend to not want to conceptualize projectiles like units, but that's why I wanted to, move the armor pen stat from a weapon to a unit. Like, it's going to be displayed on the weapon when you mouse over it or whatever. But the thought that I had was, just the idea that you would be able to like play around with the concept of projectiles as entities within the map that can be targeted and stuff. Yeah, Shamble. I feel like the nuclear missile idea is pretty clear, like where you would take a StarCraft concept and apply the system to that concept. But there's also a bunch of other stuff there. There's like, I don't know, it just feels like it's really easy to implement stuff like this. Maybe not on a technical level every time, but it just feels like it's so useful to have something. We'll call this. I think I'll just call this weapons in the table of contents. Whoa. You actually. I'm glad to see that you're a man of faith as well, Veek. Insofar as you agree with the idea of removing the classes. I didn't want to make the decision without actually consulting you about it, because we've talked about this, you and I, before. But Chalks brought it up as an idea, and that made me think about it for a while. And then I was thinking, the thing that got me was, if you think about the base, like, oh, you get +2 penetration when targeting light units if you're a concussive weapon. The trouble that I had was reasoning that through with, like, if you have an enemy with 20 armor, like, is it really that impactful to get +2 armor pen? And is that even desired for every weapon in the first place? So, yeah, it just didn't really make as much sense. Now, we have... that's one less stat, or group of stats, really, that you have to worry about as well. You're replacing size and armor or weapon type with one stat, armor pen, that does the same thing but better and scales way better. So I think it's just way cleaner. Yeah, Shamble, that's going to be a behavior for the... what do you call it? Hold on, I got to test this. Okay, that seems fine. And to log back in, let's pull that change. But yeah, that's going to be a Sycoran behavior. Okay, so this is pretty small, pretty sparse, but it makes sense. Okay, there you go. So now we have that system in. Let's talk Ansifii. homies. Oh, squads and have-nots. Okay. Let's not talk Ansifii yet. I wanted to make a point to get rid of squads here. Capital U. So for squads, I don't think it's actually going to take me this long to destroy them. I guess formations could be thrown in here too. Well, you might not always be producing workers, but the thing is, if we're already going to be... So the argument kind of has a domino effect, right? The argument of, I want to make a game where the automation is only doing stuff that the player... Like, we're only automating tasks that don't actually add to the skill expression, right? And because of that decision we've made, because of that sort of design ethic, we've made the decision to preserve what's it called? Contextual orders. So we're preserving contextual orders, but we're doing so with the idea that only the right click does a contextual order. So only the right click will rally instead of move for a building, unless the building is uprooted or something. Then you'll have to manually rally. So it changes, right? The right-click action changes based on what you're doing. We are removing that contextual element from the move command, where moving onto a unit doesn't follow. There will be a follow button instead that you'll use. But the idea of right-clicking, that does do something different. Now, if you have a rally point based on a right-click, what do you want the unit to do when it exits the rally point, or when it is finished training, right? Do you want the unit to act as if it was right-clicked on the direction, or do you want to issue a move order? If you're issuing a contextual right-click order, then loading into transports, harvesting resources, that stuff would be issued. And if you're issuing just a movement order, that's also fine. We have to decide what we're doing with that. It still is distinct from the contextual order on right-click thing enough that you can find a way to justify either approach. So I think we should probably just play with and without it and decide what we want. But maybe there's a more compelling argument that we'll discover along the way that convinces us one way or the other. Because right now we're kind of fence-sitting, where we've gone back and forth on it a little bit. With the scale that we're trying to achieve, I don't know if manually ordering units to harvest resources when they're trained is something that we want to test for. Are we trying to test players on their ability to do that when managing multiple bases? And if we are we giving them tools to make that task reasonable without it be like it's not even really that reasonable in Brood War in my opinion, but it's made a little bit easier because bases are smaller than they will be in Cosmonarchy. Like resource node quantities are smaller, so worker requirements are going to be smaller. And then obviously we've given players the opportunity to train workers from multiple sources. So for Zergus, just you have more opportunities for more larvae, but for Protoss you got the Forge, and for Terrans you have the Quarry. So the idea of being able to train workers at multiple locations to jumpstart your economy at the cost, and maybe you have a production facility that trains assault units as well, or some other utility unit that you would want to train instead, which is the old Nexus, where it was training the Scribe, the Envoy, and the Witness all at once. You could train from either one. Then I moved all of those to the Forge instead. That would allow you to inject a bunch of workers into your economy, and then it wouldn't matter that you have to order them back to the mineral line as much, because you're technically issuing less net orders. Because you say you're building 3 or 4 workers per rotation, you're just issuing one order to all 4 workers. You're just quickly selecting them and running them over. I think that would probably be fine, or maybe not probably. That has the potential to offset the issue and scale with it, and that can be an investment that the player makes to do so. But by itself, especially in the Brood War sense, where you're perpetually building workers forever, over and over again, I do think that it skews a little bit too much towards rote tasks that doesn't really add a lot to the gameplay, to the skill expression, which is kind of like if an AI can always make the more correct decision, because the correct decision is entirely based on timing and how quickly you can do something, it's not a very interesting mechanic. And so that's probably the biggest argument for Smart Rally in that sense. Now the counter arguments are probably many, like the whole abstraction of like, are you issuing a right-click unit or a right-click action, a contextual order, or are you issuing a move order, like stuff like that. Like, does it have parity with other elements in the system, or is it working alongside it, outside of that system? Is it inconsistent, that sort of thing? But this is something we need to move to the Cosmonarchy section. I probably won't even publish this particular part, but we will note this down. Well, to Shamble's point, I think if you have the money to spend on extra workers, yeah, you probably would be able to. We still have to decide what we're doing with worker pathfinding. If we can't get a reasonable pathing implementation where units don't just bumble into each other, we might have to do the shitty pathing glitch for workers. I really don't want to because it is an obvious stupid gimmick, the no collision thing. The only reason why I made it more consistent in Brood War is because it was inconsistent by default and also gave the... It was just like the pathing system is not implemented in a way that actually allows for it to be better or useful, or like that allows for it. That system needs to be in Brood War because the pathing is bad. Basically, it's not there because that's the only way you can make a good RTS. So, I'm hoping that combining the idea of harvesting multiple resource nodes at a time with not having the collision thing. But having proper pathing, like I'm hoping that will still allow efficient worker lines, but it might mean that you will reach diminishing returns faster. I'm not sure. And yeah, to answer the tacit question there, Balethal, there is no unit limit. There's no supply either. So, bye. An ocean of workers awaits you. All right, git add, git commit, out squads. Okay, so I've noted squads. I can check that off the list, and now we can go to Ansifii. All right. So like I said earlier, I wanted 1 armor and maybe 2 infantry units. I'm trying to debate what I want to do about healing. Do I want to give Ansifii a tier 1 healer? And what else do I see as like deficiencies in their current setup? So the Roadhog allows you to gap close with infantry if you can micro them well enough, because you would load units in and then you would like let them run out at the back, like unload while moving. But obviously, if the transport dies, all of the units within will get annihilated. I'm actually still not sure if that mechanic is the way we want to go, or if we want to have like a crash landing where it reduces the HP to 50% or something, or deals a certain flat amount of damage probably. But I think for now we'll operate on the assumption that units will just die if they're inside a transport that does. Sub Knight of the Realm. So based on all that, what do I see as the current core issues? I feel like it would be really nice to have some of the new stats hooked up for this, so that I could start writing prospective armor pen values. It would be 0 for the Maverick, 0 for the Squire, and maybe like 1 or 2 for the Rival. The Roadhog would probably also be 0. I imagine the Aurora would be 0. And the Constable's melee would probably be something crazy like 4 or 5, like a notable amount. But the shoulder gun would be 0 or 1, probably 0. Volt Thrower could be like 2 or 3. Cutlass would probably be sizable, like at least 2. And then the Path Sign, I feel like the Path Sign should have like really high armor pen, but I don't know. I'll say like 2 or 3 again as like a safe bet, and then we'll just play around with that idea. So I guess I'll note this in here. Conveniently, I still have this file, so we'll say armor pen values and Ansifii. I'll move this to the scratch pad actually. I can't actually save this information into the... I guess I could put it in the notes of the units, actually. I can't wait for an actual... hold on. Let's do Aurora. You know what I should do? I can't believe I didn't think of this sooner. Clearly we need to... yeah, I'm going to do this. Just so it's easier for me when sorting through this stuff to actually see what units, what are units and what are buildings. And on the plus side, I get to put U in front of everything. Well, not everything, but a lot of stuff. All right. The only trouble is now I have to go through and update the files. But yeah, because they were supposed to be... what do you call it? They were supposed to be... heavy armor in... like in the context of thinking about them as a... as like having a lot of armor, I think it makes a lot of sense. But it is tough to... come up with like shit on the fly for what the values exactly would be. Town center is probably pretty easy to imagine. Okay. Let me just make sure I got this correct. Yeah. Okay. So the only other thing is that the abilities need something. I have to do U in front of these. I don't actually think the abilities used by, ironically enough, it's called used by. I don't think it's used by the website. But for the sake of consistency, since I was filling it up before anyway, I will throw it in. Because even though it's not necessarily used by it right now, you know how it is. Okay, so we've done that. Let's go back to Ansifii units. And I will throw on the fulcrum and the gallery because we're going to be making some more concepts for those. And I'll also take the quarry. Call this B Watchdog. Even though Watchdog obviously is not going to be the actual title because there are no dogs in this universe. Well, there probably will be dogs. But there will be dogs in the sense that I'll say, look, it's a dog, even though it's not a dog. If you know what I mean. If you've watched my playthroughs and you watched me play, like, Dead Space or something, you know I call everything a dog. It'll be a dog. A lot of this naming conventions are all different. I'm not aware, since he's not doing any art currently. If he has, I'm not actually aware. I'm pretty sure that he has not yet, because he probably would have said something. Or sent me like a progress pic or something. So I'll probably just start on that myself sometime next week. Yeah, I'm thinking the early defensive structures will have like 1 or 2, so they'll be a lot more approachable than you might expect. Potentially, anyway. Or as approachable as you might expect. For a second, I was looking for the supply field in cost to think like, I got to make sure to remove supply from this unit because it's a building. It doesn't cost supply. And then I remember nothing costs supply. That's epic. we'll play around with its stats over time, obviously. All right, we got that. I guess in that case, I have to go into the U Mason. Where's my U Mason? Well, I don't really think it will. It's definitely it's the biggest challenge we face, but there are a number of people who we already know and a number of people who we don't already know that we will become acquainted with rather soon, I imagine, that will be interested in helping us out. That last part about them being people we don't yet know is a bit of faith on my part. But I think there will be enough interested people who want to throw their hat in the ring and do some work for the greater good, for allowing this game to exist. And then I can obviously pay them when we get paid, when the game comes out. The biggest trouble for me is naturally is trying to convince people of getting that buy-in, looking for skilled people or people who are willing to learn the skill over time, and also not feeling like a dickhead for saying, I can't pay you. Because obviously I want to be able to pay people for the services rendered, but it's not always feasible. So that'll be difficult. What's up, McCree? Actually, I'm working on the tech tree map for the most familiar regency, aka race. You can read all about the documentation we have so far if you type !Xibalba in the chat, or just get over to this website URL. I've written a ton of stuff. We got documentation for 20 unique regencies, aka races, aka factions. So things are happening. Art's been started, and a whole bunch of other shit's been started. I was demonstrating some progress that we had made with a fog of war and other stuff in the engine, as well as a selection, which I guess I can quickly show off since you've asked. Ignore the splash art. It's not related yet. But we got, unit selection. You got unlimited unit selection. Collision's a bit funky right now, but still being worked on. You got units being trained automatically right now, just as a test of it. You got patrol. You got shift orders. This guy's going to control himself. You got a screen, a mini-map that you can click on. Holy shit. I didn't even know that part. No transports yet. I can't select. I can't even just select the dropship because it's occupying the same cell. There you go. I can't select the dropship yet, but that'll be possible. Or I mean, I can select it, but I can't load units into it yet. Patrol can be queued, but it's a bit funky. That's interesting. I didn't know that. I guess I'll test it out. That would make patrol way better if it was consistently like when you're adding patrol with a queue, it's adding a waypoint before it loops back, and then I guess if it's close enough to the original position, it'll just loop automatically. Or I guess no, it would just loop when it reaches the last one. It would go back to the first, probably automatically. That's pretty neat. That's the feature they don't even have in Brood War. That's pretty awesome. What if I order this? I'll add the patrol command to the movement command. Okay, it seems to work. That's pretty cool. Yeah. The more you know. Yeah, visually it's going to look different because we're running at higher frame rates. Obviously, eventually we're going to have completely custom assets It's not set in the StarCraft universe. It's its own game. It'll be its own retail experience eventually. So obviously we're not going to be like selling a game that has Blizzard art in it, of course. But yeah, good shit, Veek. Nice stuff. There probably is some way to unlock the FPS, but I don't know about it. And I'm pretty sure it would desync single player from multiplayer completely. Yeah, as far as a batch action to convert BNB to PNG while preserving the alpha, I don't know. Maybe that's something you could look into, because that would probably involve like a program or a utility or something that does it. There's nothing in Photoshop. File operations in Photoshop batch actions are just useless. Like actually telling it to save a new file correctly with like a completely different extension. I guess I could try it. But for the most part, I think I can only save as the same extension as the original file, in my experience. We do assets. Ah, shit, there's a flag doodad. I didn't even know about that. All right, we'll test with the... So the trouble is, I think I have to manually... Like, if I just save this as a PNG, I don't think the alpha is not preserved, I'm pretty sure. Because this would be transparent in the background instead of being black, so... Although, let me just open this up in Photoshop, and I will see if the channel is there. Yeah, it's not. Okay. So, now we have to make an action. We'll call this BMP to PNG. With alpha, obviously. We'll say select alpha. Select the top leftmost pixel. Select inverse. Oh, wait, no, I guess we wouldn't select inverse, actually. Delete this. And then we would convert to smart object. We'll rasterize. Delete. And then save as PNG. Say no compression. I assume it's not interlaced. Save. All right. Now I can try batch actioning this. All right, we'll do a quick copy, and then we'll just delete all the GFX files that are in here. Oh, wait. All right. Okay, I guess we'll try that. See what happens. Yeah, this is what I knew was gonna happen. It's gonna make me fucking save it manually. Oh, I don't even know if it'll work for the engine graphics. I might just have to reprocess those. I'm assuming I will anyway. Like, almost certainly will. Okay, we'll just cancel this. I'll do that later on, or investigate it later on. Yeah, I've messed around with Blender a few times now. It's something that I will eventually be capable of doing, but for now, there's the question of the practicality of attempting it while I'm trying to do a bunch of other stuff. So I think I'll at least wait for the Ansifii concepts from you to roll in a little bit. So we have like a nice foundation for tier 1, and so that I also have enough time to get the general gist of what I want out of the Ansifii completely done. And then my plan after that is to generate enough assets between whoever's making models to get a reasonable amount of, like, some sort of reasonable placeholder set of textures that aren't proprietary, which I'll probably either I'll find a way to generate them myself, or I'll find some from some website probably, and slap together some stuff for the sake of showing a vertical slice of terrain, resources. So you'd see an Ansifii mining operation. If we can get a vertical slice where it's just a slow like camera pan of an Ansifii mining operation, then that's like what I can use then to say like progress is being made. Here's a GIF, or here's a fucking video or whatever. And then if we can get some vertical slices of, you know, units firing projectiles at each other, like two Ansifii fighting each other with distinct colors, then that'll be the next vertical slice. And so we'll just keep like getting enough stuff to try to build interest and try to, in a way, advertise. But we're not advertising for the sake of like, oh, here's what we want to do. We want to make this, we want your money or whatever. Like, we're not selling anything yet. It's not out yet. But if we can get enough people to be interested in it, that we get word of mouth spread, that'll be working out pretty good. Yeah, everything is going to be 3D modeled and then rendered into a spreadsheet. A sprite sheet. Spreadsheet. Render it into an Excel file, actually. So yeah, that's the plan anyway. I think it will be successful. Vic was doing some math and figured out that like just for I think he only did the calculations for units for regencies, or maybe buildings and units or something. Let me see. 140 models per race for 20 races. 6 races, we would need 2.25 models a day, and if we wanted to ship in a year. And we want to ship sooner than a year, so we obviously need more than 2.25 models a day, and that's just for units and structures. That's not for what do you call it? Doodads, upstarts, campaign-specific stuff, terrain, that sort of thing. So let's just say a conservative estimate would be about 1,000 models. So we definitely need more than what we had initially expected. Or not really initially expected. I knew it was going to be crazy, but that's fine. That's just how it is. We'll get there eventually. The other thing is that the estimate of 10 units per tier, which lends us to the 100 units per regency, might also not even be true. Like, I'm already feeling like we probably only need 1 more unit in tier 1 infantry, or tier 1 in general, instead of the 2 or 3 that it would take to get to 9 to 10 units. So, I mean, maybe we could use another orbital unit straight out the gate, but I'm not sure if that's the case. We definitely want 1 more armor unit at least. I guess if we decided to go for 3 each, then if you really want to do the math, 3 infantry, 3 armor, 3 orbital, and 1 infrastructure for each tier would work as the way to achieve 10. But that estimate is not there because there's a magic value to having 10 per tier on average. It's there because that's what I assumed would be required to make each tier on average feel impactful. But maybe that's also not the case, and there's definitely going to be outliers anyway. Like, maybe you'll get up to a specific tier, like an end game tier, and you'll only be getting access to like 3 or 4 units, which means that if we were still hitting the 10 units per tier average, then that would be something that just gets offset by like other tiers that are more loaded with units. But I'm not sure how many you actually need. Like, I don't know. I'm not really convinced that we absolutely need like a ton of units per tier either. So we might end up deciding to go against that. And maybe we end up having less units per regency than we initially thought. Or maybe we go beyond 10 tiers and we still hit the same number of units, but it's not the per tier that we initially thought. Plenty of opportunities, plenty of options. I've decided I want to rename the Squire from what it originally is called to something else. However, I don't know what I want that to be, so I will now consult thesaurus.com. Action verb. Can't have action verbs, noob. I think Rival encapsulates the sort of boxer type vibe that I wanted that unit to have. Where it's like, he's like, yeah, let's fucking go. And you punch emojis, you. But there's probably some other terms that will come up. I think you missed the disclaimer earlier in the stream where all the names are WIP. But shouldn't even have to say that. No, I don't think so. He's probably somebody who will have that. He'll probably have that developer tag popped off because that was more so when he was doing some art for. He was doing some art way back for when it was still called Hydra, actually. You know what I mean? was thinking of working the term buck into it, but didn't really make as much sense. I did also think about vault, but I think I'm going to use that term for like a secondary worker production facility structure as opposed to the verb. Leap was the word for the. It said noun, leap. So I don't think they can put it in or something. I don't know. Leaping. Even though that's not even the same fucking tense. This website is stupid. Who made this website? Bushwhack. That's a term. I kind of like waylay. Could be waylady. Lady. See you, homie. Snooze while you can. Waylady would be the lamest name of all time, to be honest. We'll go with waylay for now, because I got to use Squire for something else. I shouldn't even bother listing the organic or mechanical stuff, to be honest. No longer has a gameplay impact. Suppose we'll formalize what hover actually means. That's my working concept for hover anyway, the half speed reduction. We'll see if that sticks. You know what I just realized is that it's probably... Notepad++ is a shit program is what I just realized. It's probably better to actually put the Squire in here as a 0, as the first one, and then the Roadhog can be the second. Oh. Which means in the fulcrum I've got to swap the... There you go. So it's got kind of middling stats, but it has that hover passive, which will give it a little bit of utility, and roll as a harassment craft. Let's check to see if we got everything correct here. If we don't list the weapon type we get owned. Well, I guess we'll, there you go. Oh, and I guess we are missing something related to... Oh, we're missing this. That's what we're missing. And then I didn't actually write an origin for it. Okay. I think we got some shit here. That's fine. Okay. So that's pretty solid. It wasn't a massive amount of work on the tech tree stuff, but it still work. I'm not sure if this is the final picture for tier 1. It depends on how long I actually want people to stay at tier 1 for, or to be allowed to stay at tier 1 for. How deep can you specialize? I think the idea of having each tier feed into the next tier reasonably well in terms of if you unlock a production structure, like a gallery, fulcrum, omnibay, you'll have access to units in the next tier, but essentially having a shelf life for the production facilities, just like you have a shelf life presumed for the units themselves before they get outmoded. I think that's pretty important. So you'll kind of see like base tier, specialization tier, base tier, specialization tier. That's sort of, shall we say, a pattern. And then maybe at tier 5 will be like a really big breakpoint or something where in addition to being a new base tier, it's also like more significant power spike or something, if we wanted to go that route, which is certainly possible, something that we can experiment with later on. So that's stuff we'll think about. We'll figure it out over time. For now, I'll sit on this because I don't yet immediately have any ideas as to what we might need otherwise. Certainly a healer, but whether that's going to be tier 1 or tier 2, I'm still not decided on. And I also don't really know what kind of format the healer will come in. Will it be something like a cleric / medic from Brood War? Will it be something more like the shaman from Cosmonarchy Brood War? I'm not sure. So I'll think a little bit about that and see where we go. And that will do it for me. Thanks everybody for hanging out, and remember to check back in 2 more days when I do another one of these streams. Don't know when, but I'll see you then.